No, it isn't the end of capitalism, and it probably isn't the end of free market capitalism. But I think one of the questions you asked, Larry, at the start was, can this be fixed? And in one sense, I think it can't be fixed, because it seems to me that the assumption underlying most of the policies that have been introduced, other than simply to prevent the banking system collapsing precipitately, the underlying assumption has been that a status quo, a condition of normalcy which existed in the past, can be re-established. And I don't think that's possible. I think that the state of affairs that existed in the 20 years that have existed in the 20 years since the fall of the Berlin Wall was extremely abnormal in various ways. It was abnormal in its ideological triumphalism. It was abnormal in its extreme unrealism. It was abnormal in the sense that wholly unrealistic and even utopian ideas were picked up not by the extreme left or by the far right, but by the center. The idea of creating a global free market out of all the different types of capitalism that existed in the world and all the different types of economic systems really was attempts were made to implement it. So I think we're at the fag-end now of a particular type of capitalism, the debt-based finance capitalism that has been prevalent in Britain and the United States and some other countries in the last 20 years, has really come to an end. And I think one sort of interesting question one should ask is, why weren't the warnings that some institutions and some people sent out, as it were, over the last few years, why weren't they heeded? Because there were some warnings. There were one or two academic economists, I say one or two, maybe three or four out of the tens of thousands that there are in the whole world, alerted people to, attempted to alert the world to the dangers that were being run up in terms of debt and also especially derivatives. There were practitioners who attempted, practitioners of markets, Buffett, Soros, and others. There were people like Nassim Taleb, a hedge fund manager, who several years before the crash not only said that the American banks were sitting on barrels of dynamite, but was fairly specific about what would happen. It is not the case, as one is often told, that a clock will be right twice a day, so that people who have been preaching doom will eventually be proved true. These people, Taleb, Rubini, and others, gave specific reasons why we were in difficult circumstances, and so I think actually also did our chairperson tonight, Larry Elliott. These were very specific warnings, and there were warnings even from institutions, the Bank of International Settlements, the IMF, in an occasional moment of lucidity, pointed to some of the dangers that were there, but they weren't heeded. There was talk, nearly ubiquitous talk, and some of it became the basis of action among the safe hands who usually run these things in banks and in industries. There was talk of the great moderation, the new paradigm, Davos man, the weightless economy, the long boom. Nonsense from beginning to end. But lots of very sober, grave-looking, reassuringly wooden people accepted it. And so I think the first thing is that age, that period of opinion, that period of thought is gone for good. And the problem we face now, I think, is it's not quite clear what's going to replace it. What's not going to replace it is some new universal paradigm, it seems to. What's not going to replace it is some global new order either, because I think actually what we're in for now is a period of great uncertainty lasting a number of years. We're only at the first stages of a protracted and deep shift, revolutionary in its implications, which I myself think is not best compared with the 1930s, but with something more recent, namely the communist collapse, which changed things irreversibly. And I think the key idea I would like to transmit tonight is that the changes that have occurred in the United States with the implosion of its financial institutions are irreversible. We don't know whether the flotation, the stimulus announced by Obama and the earlier bailouts announced by Paulson under the Bush administration, we don't know whether they'll work or not. They may be too small, but at the same time, too much for America to afford. We don't know, probably because they don't know, whether China will continue to have this mutually advantageous, up till now, relationship with the US of buying very significant amounts of treasuries of American federal debt. We don't know if that will continue. One shadow, it seems to me, we should bear in mind, and this is something which I think a number of people are now beginning to point to, is that the actual impact on real economies, on employment, on businesses, and on governments now is beginning to be felt. We've had, so far, only a couple of changes of government, Latvia and Iceland. We haven't yet had actually changes of regime. That hasn't happened yet anywhere. But I think a crisis of this size, a change of this size, the largest bubble in history, the biggest bust in history, is bound to be followed by changes of regime in various parts of the world. And it seems that, from what one can gather from their statements, the few statements they make to the press about these matters, that in China they are worried that unemployment in particular could pose a threat to regime stability. And one cloud on the horizon is that if, in order to deal with that, they launch an even larger bailout, an even larger stimulus than they've done so far, one which, by the way, unlike the United States, China can afford if it diverts some of the money which is being spent on American treasuries to domestic purposes, then this relationship which has existed between China and America, which is the key, I think, geopolitical relationship probably of the last 20 years, could well come unstuck. And if that happens, then we're in genuinely new territory. So I guess my first point then is that this is a big change, a change not only in banking or even in the real economy. It's a geopolitical change as well as anything else. It's the meltdown of a certain type of neoliberal model of debt-based financial capitalism. What can be done to fix it? Well, of course, Keynes has come back into
always gets a clap.
And I'm a great fan of Keynes, I should say. Tremendous admiration for him, not only as an economist, but also as a writer, a theorist of probability, immensely cultivated man. And knew a great deal about the history of economic thought as well, which is something that's fallen out of economics in recent times. But I just wonder whether the rather mechanical reliance on Keynesianism isn't actually a kind of desperation among our policymakers. Most of them are of a certain age, my age, so I'm not criticizing them. When Keynes was still taught, if you were at university, as embodying economic orthodoxy, and they're falling back on that. But this is not the 1930s. There are lots of differences, geopolitical differences. There's no communism, there's no Nazism. There are many other things, but there aren't these two vast totalitarian movements. The economy is much more integrated and globalized than it then was. China and India are no longer colonially subjugated countries. They're rapidly industrializing, independent, sovereign states. So we're living in a different world. But also, crucially, the situation of America has changed. Refloating America now, stimulating the economy, reviving the economy, comes up against the fact that it's no longer the world's manufacturing base. China is. It's been hollowed out. A lot of the production's been offshored. It's not quite clear what will be achieved if there's a tremendous reliquefaction of the American economy. It might be simply stagflation. It might simply be high levels of inflation. Now, that connects with something else I'd like to just mention, because it's sort of intrigued me the way 6 months ago, 9 months ago, worries which many of us had been ventilating about resources, particularly about oil, had been percolated into the mass media and were being discussed, have vanished completely over the last few months. But it seems to me that issues about peak oil, issues about resource crunches haven't ceased to be valid just because some speculators have been forced to unwind large bets and the price of oil has precipitously collapsed from 140 odd down to 40 or maybe even under 30 for a while. It could go. The background situation hasn't really, the situation of supply and demand in the world hasn't altered, which is that supplies are very finite despite the new technologies for extracting oil. There's no systemic alternative to oil, and demand is going up with worldwide industrialization. That continues to be the situation now. So I think one of the things that would be good to inject into our thinking is that if when we get to the deflationary phase of this crisis, it won't remain deflationary forever, perhaps even not for very long, because quantitative easing and money printing is going on not only in America and Britain but in many other countries. Once we get through that and prices begin to come up and demand recovers, a lot of pent-up demand in the world, the price of oil and of energy in general and of other resources will go way back up again, probably quite quickly. And are we prepared for that? I don't think we are. It's completely slipped from our thoughts, and I think probably in the next 6 to 9 months it will slip even more profoundly from our thoughts as we look into a kind of deflationary abyss of hollowed-out market towns where not a single shop is working, where unemployment ratchets up significantly, as it's now bound to do in America and Britain and many parts of Europe, and as Europe begins to feel the full brunt of the crisis because of the way Western European banks have leveraged themselves onto the post-communist East European economies. I follow the people I trust in this. I haven't got direct sources, but from what I can see and hear, some of the big West European banks are much more leveraged against Eastern European debt than the American banks are against subprime debt. And so the next wave of the crisis seems to be the one that we can predict. We can't look too far into the future, but the next wave, where there's already plenty of evidence which way we're going, will be one in which countries like Ukraine, Poland, the Baltic states, Hungary, and others face really serious problems as a result of having gotten involved in all kinds of foreign exchange and other relationships that are now coming seriously unstuck, and the actual economy, the productive economy, will suffer very badly. And in that period, I think, all thought of resource scarcity, all thought of environmental issues, all thought of climate change will go out the window. The overwhelming priority in the news, in politics, and everyone else will simply be to get the show back on the road again. And I don't think that's actually even possible. We'll come up immediately against resource constraints. We'll come up immediately against inflation because of the huge amount of quantitative easing that's gone on. And I'm not at all confident that the existing leaderships, political leaderships, or even intellectual leaderships in most countries have grasped the scale of the problem, the depth of the problem, or what the next stage is likely to be. I'm not really I hope not here to make specific recommendations of any kind, but just say something in general. I mean, I think what we should be looking forward to is a more resilient, a less debt-based, a more resilient, a leaner type of capitalism, but one in which banks have a different function. They'll be more like public utilities. They won't be gambling joints the way they've been lately. And also, we've got to look forward to period in which the welfare state is renewed rather than simply dismantled. Because one of the things I anticipate in Britain, whichever government wins the next election, is that in order to avoid real dangers with regard to sovereign debt crises, there will be massive, and I mean really massive, probably unprecedented cuts in public expenditure. And in those contexts, it's very important that the security that people need to enjoy any kind of tolerable form of life, let a decent one, through the welfare state, is preserved. So it would be good if we could start thinking about those issues now, not 2 years down the road when everything's gone into a deeper level of crisis.